lords, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Scarborough.
Scarborough on a summer bank holiday, and the seafront is busy with holidaymakers enjoying a day by the seaside. This is how most people think of Scarborough, a place to let your hair down and to enjoy the attractions of a traditional seaside resort. Scarborough has been a magnet for summer holidaymakers for several hundred years. Now they come for the amusements, the ice creams and the beach, but the first summer visitors were drawn to Scarborough 300 years ago to drink the health-giving waters at the spa, where people now relax listening to concerts on summer afternoons. Long before people started coming to Scarborough for their health or pleasure, the town was an important fishing port. Fishermen have been landing their catches at Scarborough Harbour for over 800 years, and during all this time they've been watched over by the ancient walls of Scarborough Castle. It was the construction of the castle around the year 1150 which first encouraged the forebears of the present fishing community to settle at Scarborough and develop the harbour as a fishing port. From these small beginnings the town developed and grew to become the busy place we know today. The castle walls have been reduced to ruins with the wear and tear of the passing centuries and the effects of several bloody sieges. However, the ruined walls are still a powerful reminder that Scarborough has had a long and eventful history. Traces of the town and fishing port which grew up under the shadow of the castle are much harder to find. Most of the remains of early Scarborough lie buried beneath the modern town, where they wait to be discovered by archaeologists. In this video we'll be looking at what the local Archaeological Society has been doing to uncover traces of Scarborough's buried history. Our story begins in the early autumn of 1066. Scarborough enters the pages of history when it's attacked by an enormous Viking fleet carrying an invading army of several thousand heavily armed warriors. Led by the Norwegian king Harald Hardrada, the Viking fleet landed in the South Bay and brought death and destruction to Scarborough. They lit a large bonfire on the headland and threw the burning embers down onto the houses below, setting fire to the whole settlement. We don't know how many fell victim to the Vikings before the fleet sailed away, but the dead of Scarborough were revenged a few short days later when the Viking army was destroyed just outside York at the Battle of Stamford Bridge. Archaeologists have yet to find remains of the settlement destroyed by the Vikings in 1066, and Scarborough is not mentioned again for almost 100 years. In 1154, King Henry II was crowned king, and almost one of the first actions was to take the long journey north to make sure he had undisputed control over Yorkshire and the north of England. At Scarborough he found that a local nobleman called Count William had fortified the headland by building a timber castle. King Henry forced Count William to surrender his castle and had it demolished, replacing it with a much stronger stone fortress, of which the keep still stands today. The keep is around 100 feet high and took nearly 10 years to complete. Although nothing survives of Count William's timber castle, we can imagine what it must have looked like. It would have stood roughly where King Henry's keep now stands, and at its heart would have been a tall tower where the garrison would have lived. To give the town more protection, it would have been surrounded by a wooden stockade. People may have been attracted to come and live close to Count William's castle, their houses stretching along part of what's now Castle Road. The houses would have been of timber with thatched roofs, and the people would have made their living from farming or trading with the garrison of Count William's castle. All this was swept away when King Henry took control of Scarborough. He transformed the headland by building the castle keep, but his plans for Scarborough didn't stop there. King Henry recognised that the South Bay offered one of the safest anchorages along the Yorkshire coast, and so he decided to try and develop a port and town here alongside his new castle. To do this, the king ordered streets and building plots to be laid out below the castle walls, in the hope of encouraging more people to come and settle at Scarborough. The king's plans proved successful, and within the space of a few short years, Scarborough grew to be one of the largest towns in Yorkshire. The town covered a vast area stretching from the foot of the castle hill up to where the Grand Hotel now stands. The harbour was at the heart of the town, and soon the port was welcoming trading vessels from far and wide across the North Sea, attracted by the prospect of buying the fish landed at Scarborough. Looking down on Scarborough in the middle of the 14th century, we can see that most of the streets, especially down towards the harbour, are lined with houses. The population of the town has grown and prospered in the 2 centuries since King Henry established the town. Notice how the streets follow a grid pattern, crossing each other at right angles. This was how King Henry ordered the streets to be laid out, and 850 years later the same grid pattern of streets is still at the heart of the old town. On the hill towards the castle we can recognise the parish church of St Mary. There were fewer houses up here in the 14th century compared to the rest of the town, but the open ground would have been put to good use. Here the townsfolk could pasture animals and grow crops to provide some of their food, and it was also in these open spaces where industries such as the manufacture of pottery took place. The parish church is the only major building surviving from the medieval town, and it's undergone many changes since the first church was erected on the site in the middle of the 12th century. Some parts of the church are nearly as old as the castle keep, but over the centuries the church has been added to and altered as the town grew in prosperity and wealth. These chapels on the south side of the church date back to the end of the 14th century and were built by wealthy townsfolk so that prayers could be said for their departed souls. This plaque in the wall of St Mary's commemorates the fact that an order of monks called the Cistercians played a major part in running the parish church. These monks are well known for the magnificent abbeys they founded throughout Europe, including locally at places such as Rievaulx and Fountains. By the time this famous visitor was laid to rest in the churchyard, the medieval magnificence of St Mary's Church had all but been lost through centuries of neglect, following its virtual destruction in 1645, when the castle was besieged during the English Civil War. Leaving the parish church behind, there are a few other traces of medieval Scarborough to be seen around the town, especially here down by the harbour. Here at number 2 Quay Street, a small timber-framed house gives a good impression of the sort of buildings there would have been in the medieval town. Its timber frame would originally have been infilled with panels of woven twigs and mud, called wattle and daub. The outside could well have been plastered to keep the weather out. The first windows would have been simple openings protected by a leather or textile covering. These windows are much too sophisticated for a medieval building and were probably added in the 18th century. On Sandside is one of Scarborough's most distinctive houses called the Richard III House, after the tradition that the king is supposed to have stayed here when he visited Scarborough towards the end of the 15th century. A statue of the Hunchback King is preserved behind this cage on the outside of the building. The house could well date back to the time of King Richard. Several other timber frame houses are to be found elsewhere along Quay Street. Inside they would have had floors of beaten earth or clay, with a hearth open to the rafters. Only the most wealthy householders could afford to have tile floors and proper fireplaces. One of Scarborough's oldest houses is the Three Mariners on Quay Street. This seems to date back to the Middle Ages, judging by the fact that it's built around a wooden frame, as these massive timbers exposed on the outside of the building indicate. There's evidence that the timber building was originally much larger, extending further along Quay Street, and that half of it was probably demolished in the 18th century. As well as the parish church and the houses, there are a few other clues to the medieval town still to be seen. This plaque commemorates the Buttercross, which is the only one of the town's medieval market crosses to have survived, though these forbidding railings now hide it from view. Even some of the street names in the old town are a link to medieval times. The Auborough in Auborough Street refers to the Old Borough, which was the name given to the first part of the town laid out by King Henry 850 years ago. When he added further streets to the town some years later, they became known as the New Borough, a name which also continues down to the present day. So if we know where to look in Scarborough, we can still find traces of the medieval town. But to discover more, we need to look below the ground and unearth the rich variety of remains from medieval times which we know are buried beneath our feet. It needs the skills of the town's archaeologists to bring these buried remains to light, and every year they make new discoveries about the medieval town.
There's nothing that looks like modern brick or modern tiles.
So you have to include that.
Yeah, so
That's fine.
that'll go into tile.
Each excavation is different, but we'll take a look at one of the most important digs of recent years, which led to the discovery of one of the town's lost medieval chapels and an ancient stream which used to flow across the heart of the old town. We know that in medieval times the parish church of St Mary had a close neighbour called the Chapel of St Sepulchre. This chapel lay down the hill from the parish church in the heart of the medieval town, but though it was a popular place of worship for the townsfolk, it fell into disrepair over 400 years ago. The lead was stripped from its roof, and the walls were torn down to get stone to repair the harbour defences, and very soon people had all but forgotten the chapel ever existed. All that there is to be seen today to remind us of the chapel is the name St Sepulchre Street. This is an important clue to the fact that the chapel must have stood somewhere in this part of the town. But can we pinpoint its location still further? An important piece of evidence comes from the earliest maps of the town. This one dates from 1725 and is the first detailed map of the town to have survived. Although it was surveyed nearly 200 years after the chapel of St Sepulchre had been demolished, the map still shows its churchyard. A second map, published 20 years later, also shows St Sepulchre churchyard as a small rectangular plot on the north side of the street, and by measuring from both these maps it's possible to roughly locate where along the street the church must have been situated. Although the two early town plans were not surveyed as accurately as modern maps, they both point to the fact that the church must have stood somewhere close to where this building now stands. This used to be the town's Quaker Meeting House, and it's recorded that the workmen digging the foundations for the meeting house in 1801 came across a large stone wall. Could this have been part of the missing chapel? A chance to solve the mystery of the stone wall and the location of St Sepulchre Chapel came in 1997, when the local archaeologists were asked to excavate a plot of ground behind the Quaker Meeting House before the area was developed for housing. The site lay behind this massive stone wall on the east side of Springfield, which joins the north side of St Sepulchre Street near to the Quaker Meeting House. At one end of the site was a derelict Victorian building which had begun life as a school. Round the corner from the school building is Cook's Row, which is another street which dates back to medieval times. The name tells us the occupation of the people who lived along this street, and we can easily imagine how busy this street would have been with people visiting the stalls of the cooks and bakers. The site was large enough for the archaeologists to plan an extensive excavation campaign to try and discover the location of St Sepulchre Chapel and to discover what other medieval remains might be buried on the site. The archaeologists spent many weekends digging on the site, and like detectives they were able to slowly piece together all the clues to what this part of Scarborough was like in medieval times. Their first task was to try and get to the bottom of the mystery surrounding the location of St Sepulchre Chapel. Armed with the information from the early Scarborough maps, the archaeologists knew that digging a trench near the Quaker Meeting House offered the best chance of unearthing the remains of the lost church. Digging carefully so as not to destroy anything of importance, the archaeologists began to excavate, and very quickly unearthed the remains of a well-built stone wall, still standing several feet high. The wall was very well preserved. Even the tool marks made by the masons when dressing the stones could still be seen. These tool marks showed that a lot of care and attention went into building this wall, hinting at the fact that it must have been part of an important structure. Only one side of the wall was found in this first trench. Next to it was a surface of clay which was probably the floor level inside the building. A second trench found the rest of the wall, although part of it has been destroyed by the foundations for the Quaker Meeting House. This must have been the same wall which was found in 801 when the meeting house was being built. The wall proved to be immense. It was over 4 feet wide, which points to the fact that the building must have been built with massive stone walls. There can be little doubt that the archaeologists had discovered part of St Sepulchre Chapel, which had escaped being destroyed by stone robbers 400 years ago. Finding the wall was not the end of their discoveries about the chapel. A nearby trench unearthed this fragment of stonework, which proved to be tracery from one of the windows of the chapel. It must have been cast to one side when the church was demolished. Examples of similar window tracery can still be found in medieval churches in the area, like this example. Large numbers of stone roof tiles were also found near the church. These are made from local stone, and some tile fragments still preserve the hole by which the tile was pegged onto the rafters. Finding these tiles indicates that at some time the church was probably roofed with stone tiles, like this example of a medieval dovecote at Brompton. The evidence from the excavations allowed the archaeologists to build up a picture of what St Sepulchre Chapel might have looked like in medieval times. It wouldn't have been as large as the parish church, but its tower would still have dominated the street to which it gave its name. Future excavations will undoubtedly find out more about this building now its location has been firmly established. As the excavation progressed, more of the medieval town came to light. At the opposite end of the site to the church, the archaeologists uncovered evidence that there were a range of houses bordering on to Cook's Row, whilst they found a stream cross the middle of the site. Old documents mention a stream in this area which was known in medieval times as the Damyet. The last vestiges of the stream were piped underground in Victorian times. So, like the chapel of St Sepulchre, it was another part of the medieval town which had been lost. Although the waters of the Damyet no longer flow above ground, This trench quickly filled up with water, telling the archaeologists that they had found the old watercourse. The line of boulders down the edge of the trench is an artificial embankment built during the 16th century to stop the stream from flooding over the site. When this stone boundary wall was constructed in the 19th century, the stream no longer flowed above ground, but nevertheless the builders of the wall took the precaution of putting this grating into the base of the wall to let water pass underneath. The discovery of the line of the stream allowed the archaeologists to plan a further trench elsewhere on the site, to uncover more of the watercourse. The second trench was excavated next to the Victorian School building, and months of painstaking digging revealed a truly spectacular find. In the medieval period, this part of the stream had been made to flow along a stone-lined culvert, the walls of which were still perfectly preserved. The walls were constructed of neatly squared blocks and still stood nearly 4 feet high, although they were probably over 600 years old. As soon as the archaeologists emptied the culvert of the rubble and the earth filling, water began to flow along it for the first time in over 400 years. In medieval times, this stream would have been one of the main sources of fresh water for the townsfolk. It's still a mystery as to who ordered the construction of the culvert, but the most likely is that it was connected with St Sepulchre Chapel, or perhaps with a neighbouring religious establishment called the Franciscan Friary. The friars could well have ordered the construction of the culvert to help improve the drainage of the ground near to the friary. The Franciscan Friary was where Friarage School now stands. Discovering the Damyet stream led the archaeologists to try and follow its course across the town. It started about a mile inland in springs where Albemarle Crescent now stands. From here it courses down towards the sea, and it can be picked out by looking along some of the streets which cross its path. Here, for example, it's noticeable how Queen Street dips into the shallow valley created by the Damyet stream. As the stream approaches the site of the excavation, its course can be traced by the rise and fall in the playground of Friarage School. In medieval times this was the Franciscan Friary, and the stream would have crossed right through their grounds. After passing through the site of the excavation, the stream continued across St Sepulchre Street, where its course is again given away by this dip in the road. It continued in this direction, flowing into the South Bay somewhere close to the bottom of Eastborough. The archaeologists ended the excavation by digging some more trenches near the Victorian School building to try and discover what had stood between the Damyet stream and Cook's Row. They found that an impressive stone building stood on the opposite side of the stream to St Sepulchre's Chapel in medieval times. The house would have faced onto Cook's Row and was undoubtedly one of the largest buildings along the street. All that survived of the house were the foundations of its walls, which nevertheless were over 3 feet wide and built of stone. In one trench, a hearth was found next to a wall, suggesting this was part of the building where cooking took place. These stone slabs on the outside of the same stone wall may be the foundations for an external staircase leading up to the main living quarters on the first floor. The archaeologists excavated a second trench inside a derelict greenhouse to find more remains of this building. In this trench they came across an area of cobblestones which must have been the entranceway to the house from Cook's Row. Looking along Cook's Row, we can pinpoint the place where the cobbled entrance to the house would have emerged onto the street in medieval times. In this same trench, the archaeologists continued to dig below the level of the building to try and find what took place on the site before the house was built. To their surprise, they found that earlier in time, this part of the site had been an area of rather marshy ground, next to the Damyet stream. They found that people had dumped all this earth and rubbish onto the site to raise the ground before they started building, presumably in the hope that they could protect the area from being flooded by the Damyet stream. Cook's Row probably marks where the marshy ground ended on this side of the Damyet stream. As the archaeologists dug on the site, they continually unearthed fragments of medieval pottery which were part of the household rubbish thrown onto the site in medieval times. The style of the pots tells the archaeologists the approximate date of the remains they've unearthed, so all the sherds are carefully gathered up and washed at the end of each day's digging, and then put in bags for further study and analysis. Other objects found on the site include iron fish hooks, like this example, and iron nails which would have been used in construction work. This small fragment of decorated stone may have come from the chapel of St Sepulchre. This object is an iron door key. How someone must have cursed when they lost this 700 or 800 years ago. After unearthing such important remains, the archaeologists paid careful attention to making an accurate record of everything they've found. Here they're making drawings of the medieval culvert, so that when the remains are reburied, anyone who's interested will be able to tell what's been discovered. Because of the importance of the remains on the site, they'll be preserved when the site is eventually developed for housing. The site drawings form the basis for these ink plans, which are used to illustrate a detailed report on the excavation. Winter evenings see the archaeologists meeting at Allet House on Falsgrave, where all the pottery and other finds from the excavation are carefully analysed and recorded. After the research into the finds is finished, the objects are carefully packed away and sent to the museum for long-term storage, so they'll be available for study by researchers in the future. At the same time, the archaeologists try and build up a picture of how the area has changed in more recent times by searching through old maps, plans and photographs, such as these showing buildings which have been demolished. An important task the archaeologists have set themselves is to let the general public know about all they've unearthed about medieval Scarborough. National Archaeology Day in July is a good time to capture people's interests, and each year Scarborough Museum is the focus for the activities. These include guided tours of the old town to point out some of the hidden history and a visit to an archaeological excavation.
And all the things have come from a real excavation in Scarborough, and then they're actually washing some of the finds there.
I'm Chris Hall. I'm a field archaeologist with the local Archaeological Society. What we're going to do today, or this afternoon, is just have a stroll through the town, looking at the sort of history of the town through the eyes of an archaeologist, as it were, and I'll try and make it as interesting.
The year 2000 saw the excavation for National Archaeology Day, which took place near the parish church on a grassy area next to Paradise House. Visitors to the site could watch the archaeologists unearth the stone foundations of a medieval building. Many people enjoyed being able to watch an excavation taking place at close quarters, and in the process learnt something new about the vanished medieval town.
Before they built the cobbled yard. So this would have been the first property bound.
Scarborough still has many secrets from its long history to reveal to the local archaeologists. The work is never ending, but each excavation adds a little bit more to the history of the town, confirming that Scarborough has few rivals when it comes to the richness of its archaeological heritage.